true that there are hundreds of refiners and that they were doing good work. But there were reasons because of A, problems with the industry, and B, the superiority of Rockefeller that made that arrangement completely unsustainable. So when Rockefeller came into the industry in 1859, the oil industry, just for a quick crash course, began in 1859. Rockefeller arrived on the scene in 1863. And when Rockefeller arrived on the scene, oil refining was an incredibly, incredibly profitable profession. Incredibly profitable. Well, why? Much more profitable on average than drilling for oil. Well, because before oil became an industry in 1859, no one had any idea that this stuff was going to be so valuable and that there was so much of it. And for instance, in the first year, first of all, people didn't even think you could drill for oil. They thought that oil just came from, they just thought it dripped out of coal, so you could only find tiny bits of oil near coal. Then they found out you could drill for oil, and the first year they found 2,000 barrels, and a barrel is 42 gallons. The second year, they found 200,000 barrels. The third year, they found 500,000 barrels. So there was an unbelievable amount of oil, which they discovered could be turned into this really valuable product, kerosene, that everyone wanted. But no one had anticipated this, so no one had set up the infrastructure to move this stuff around and to refine it. So what happened is if you were one of the few refiners who got in, it didn't matter how efficient you were, how meticulous you were, even really how safe your product was. There was a lot of exploding kerosene back then, a lot of fires. You could make money hand over fist. And so these hundreds of refiners that were in the early refining market, they were making a really valuable product. They were making a product that was benefiting Americans. But what Rockefeller observed when he came in the industry in 1863 is they're not doing it particularly efficiently. There's a ton of waste that they can get away with because their product is in such high demand because they can get oil so cheaply, but that state of affairs won't last. Because as they keep making profits, more and more people will come into the industry, and eventually their profit margins will be driven down unless they drive down their costs. So from the beginning, what distinguished Rockefeller is, even though he could have made a lot of profit just by being a normal, moderately efficient refiner, he was obsessed with the issue of efficiency from the beginning. And this proved to be unbelievably important, because as the 1860s went on, more and more refiners, as people anticipated, moved into the market. And to give you an idea of how this impacted people, in 1865, kerosene cost 58 cents a gallon, which for the American people was a great bargain. That was cheaper than anything else they could get to light their homes. But once the industry had grown, by 1870, it was 26 cents a gallon. So you have a decline in price by over 50%. If you're in business, imagine your product or your commodity going down by that much and how that would impact your plans. And this is exactly, so for most of the people in the industry, they went from very profitable to losing a lot of money because they didn't have this focus on efficiency. But by the end of the decade, most of these hundreds of refiners were losing money. Estimates are 75, 80% of the oil industry is losing money at this point. Now, a few people in the industry are making a little bit of money, and one guy is making a ton of money, and that guy is John Rockefeller. So let's look at how he did it, and then how he poised himself to become the completely dominant presence in this struggling industry. Now, as I've indicated before, so much of it comes down to the issue of efficiency. Rockefeller was an accountant by trade. He loved numbers. He loved books. He was obsessed with accounting and business even before corporate accounting was a real widely practiced science. It wasn't really, historians say, until the 1870s, but in the 1860s, he was obsessed with it. He always wanted to know, are we being efficient, which means, are we getting the most value out of the least cost? And of course, the more efficient you are, the more profitable you are. So that was his obsession. It was, once he got into the industry, how can we make kerosene and other petroleum products as well and as cheaply as possible? And the amount of effort and genius that went into this is simply staggering. I wish I could just give you 4 hours of examples of innovations, but I'll give you a couple of examples to indicate some dimensions of this. One is just how detailed he was. So this is an example from the 1870s, once Rockefeller had become fairly dominant, maybe a 40% market share. You would think, okay, he's this high tycoon passing down orders. But no, he's on the factory floor. It's not actually a factory in those days, but he's on the floor with some people, and he's telling them, put these metal shavings here so that we can save them all up and we can melt them and we can use them. And then he notices a guy filling up tin cans with kerosene and sealing them. And he notices the guy's using drops of metal, drops of solder to seal the can. And he says, how many drops are you using? And the guy says, 40. And he says, well, why 40? He says, well, I don't know, that's what we do. And he said, have you ever tried 38? And the guy says, no. So he says, okay, well, try 38. Let me know what happens. And it turns out that with 38, almost every can did not leak, but a couple did. So Rockefeller said, okay, well, that's not acceptable. We can't have any cans leaking. So he said, try 39. And 39 turned out to be the exact perfect number of drops of solder. And when Rockefeller told this story to a biographer, he was so happy because there was just a microcent. But over time, it added up to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. And this is the mentality that he brings to every little detail. There's just a million examples. I mentioned how, I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but the efficiency issue, most refiners, they could refine about 60% of crude oil into kerosene, and then the rest of the oil they just had to dump. They didn't do anything with it. Tons and tons of oil got dumped in lakes and set on fires. Rockefeller regarded this as unacceptable. He wanted to make use of every little bit of the oil. Now, eventually, he developed facilities where he could make literally hundreds of profitable products, from wax to paint to lubricants, you name it. But at first, he couldn't do that. But even at that point, what he did was he found the refineries who could do that, who specialized in that, and he made sure that he sold all of his remaining crude to them. So that was another huge source of profit and lack of waste. He hired his own plumber because he saw that he was hiring an external plumber and it was costing him a ton, so it saved him half on his plumbing costs. He had his own internal special oil buyers because the middlemen that he used, that everyone else used, because that's how you buy oil, that was the status quo, he did not regard them as particularly good. So he had his own guys trained in Rockefeller negotiation tactics. And at the same time, he set up giant storage facilities near holding oil, so that if the oil drillers ever offered him rates that he thought were too high, he could last for a long time without their oil. So every little point of the process is broken down. We could give a lot of examples like that. But the area I really want to focus on is the area that Rockefeller is regarded as most evil in, and that is the area of railroads and transportation, because this is regarded as an area where Rockefeller is a menace that we should be fearful of, and I think we'll see that Rockefeller is a hero that we should hope that more people emulate. So the standard idea of the railroads and the rebates is, for some reason, it really doesn't make sense if you think about it. For some reason, the railroads decided to give this one random kid, and he was 23 going on 24 when he entered the industry. They decided to give some kid super, super low rates so that no one else could compete with him. But what railroad would, A, want to just give you randomly low rates? I mean, if you go into a computer store and say, hey, I want to outcompete my competition, sell me 500 computers for $50, they're not going to do it. Why would they do it? No one gives you a rebate unless it's in their interest. And you certainly wouldn't want to give someone a rebate to the point where they would have no competition. I mean, the railroads had no stake in that whatsoever. So there's just no logic to the story except for a general, well, he got so successful, so it must have been something devious. But let's look at what actually happened. So there are a couple parts of this equation. One is barrels. Barrels were an enormous problem. Generally, how to store and transport oil from the beginning of the oil industry was an enormous problem. At first, when they discovered oil, the main thing they had to put it in was wine barrels, which were approximately 42 gallons, and that became the unit of measure, and that became the way that oil was stored. But these things were incredibly expensive. They often could be $3 a barrel, which at different points of oil prices cost more than the oil that they contained. Moreover, they were really unreliable. So sometimes if Rockefeller wanted a barrel, even if he was willing to pay top dollar for it, he couldn't get it. Now, to someone with his focus on efficiency,